6:00 p.m. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the mountain pass, each flake adding to the burden already weighing down the pine branches. It was the kind of winter that tested everything: wood, stone, flesh, and spirit. The kind that made even the boldest travelers think twice before venturing beyond their hearths. But Jakob had lived through 43 such winters in these mountains, and he knew that survival wasn't about boldness. It was about preparation, routine, and accepting that loneliness was simply the price of choosing this life. He shouldered his axe and began the walk back to his cabin, his boots crunching through the knee-deep powder. The day's work had been good, enough timber cut and stacked to keep him busy through the week. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and already the light was failing, that peculiar gray, blue twilight that came too early in these short winter days. He was thinking about the stew he'd left simmering that morning, wondering if he'd added enough salt, when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost convinced himself it was the wind playing tricks through the trees. But then it came again, a weak, pitiful whimper that made something tighten in his chest. Jakob stopped, turning his head to catch the direction. There, just off the path where the snow had drifted against a fallen log, he saw what looked like a bundle of dark rags. He approached carefully, years of caution making him wary of even the most innocent seeming things in the wilderness. Bears sometimes left half-eaten kills, wolves traveled in packs, but as he drew closer, his heart sank at what he saw. It was a dog, or what remained of one. She lay on her side in the snow, her ribs pressing so sharply against her matted black fur that Jakob could count each one. Her legs were drawn up tight against her body in a futile attempt to conserve warmth, and her eyes, those eyes that met his as he knelt down, held a resignation that cut him deeper than the winter wind. She had given up. She was simply waiting for the cold to finish what starvation had begun. Jesus and Mary, Jakob whispered, his voice rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 weeks. The dog didn't move as he reached out, didn't even flinch when his bare hand. He'd pulled off his glove, touched her head. Her fur was frozen in places, crusted with ice and snow. How long had she been here? How had she even gotten this far up the mountain? Then he saw the collar, partially hidden beneath her matted fur. It was worn leather, cracked from age and weather, and when he turned it to find the buckle, he saw that it had been deliberately loosened, not broken, not torn, but unbuckled. Someone had removed this collar, had brought this dog up here or close to here, and had left her to die. The rage that filled him was sudden and fierce, warming him more than any fire. What kind of person did such a thing? What kind of cruelty abandoned a living creature to starve and freeze, rather than facing whatever responsibility they couldn't bear? But the anger was useless now. The dog's breathing was shallow, her heartbeat he could feel it under his palm, weak and irregular. She might die anyway, might be too far gone for any help he could offer. But Jakob had not survived 4 decades in these mountains by accepting defeat before trying. "Come on, girl," he murmured, working his arms beneath her carefully. She weighed almost nothing, and that frightened him more than anything else. He could feel every vertebra in her spine, every knob of bone where there should have been muscle. When he lifted her, she made no protest, only that same weak whimper that had first caught his attention. He settled her against his chest, inside his heavy coat, sharing what warmth his body could offer. Then he began the trek home, moving as quickly as the deep snow would allow. The cabin was only half a mile distant, but it felt like half the world away. The dog's head lolled against him, and he could feel her breathing change, becoming even more labored. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm despite the fear creeping through him. Just stay with me a little longer. We're almost there." The cabin appeared through the trees like a benediction, its solid log walls and smoking chimney promising warmth and safety. Jakob kicked the door open. He never locked it. What was the point up here? And carried his burden directly to the hearth. The fire had burned down to coals, but the cabin still held enough heat to make his frost-nipped cheeks sting. He laid the dog on the rag rug before the fireplace, then moved with practiced efficiency. First, he built up the fire, adding kindling and logs until flames leapt and crackled. Then he filled a pot with water and set it to warm, not boil, warm. He'd learned long ago that hypothermic animals needed gradual warming, not sudden heat. From his small store of supplies, he retrieved an old wool blanket, worn soft with age, and wrapped it carefully around the dog's body. Only then did he really look at her in the firelight. She was some kind of mixed breed, with the lean build of a shepherd or hound beneath the devastating weight loss. Her muzzle was gray, suggesting she was older, perhaps 10 or 12 years. Old enough to have given someone a lifetime of loyalty. Old enough that whoever had owned her should have known better, should have cared enough to find another way. "Bastards," Jakob muttered, and the dog's ear twitched at the sound of his voice. When the water was warm, testing it with his finger to make sure it wasn't too hot, he soaked a clean cloth and began the careful work of cleaning her fur, removing the ice and debris. She didn't resist, barely seemed aware of what was happening, but her eyes tracked his movements with dim comprehension. Next came the harder part, food. He ladled some of the stew into a bowl, but one look at her told him she couldn't manage solid food. Instead, he strained the broth, cooling it until it was barely lukewarm, and then dipped his fingers in it, letting drops fall onto her muzzle. At first, nothing, then her tongue emerged, dry and pale, licking weakly at the moisture. Hope flared in Jakob's chest. He repeated the process, patient and methodical, letting her take in the broth drop by drop. It took over an hour, but gradually she seemed to revive enough to lap directly from his cupped palm. "That's it," he encouraged softly. "That's good, girl. Just a little at a time." He knew better than to feed her too much too fast. A starving animal could die from eating too much too quickly. The shock of sudden nutrition overwhelming a body that had been cannibalizing itself to survive. Better to give her small amounts frequently, building up her strength gradually. When she finally turned her head away, refusing more broth, Jakob settled back against the log wall and simply watched her. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the windows. The dog slept, her breathing still shallow but perhaps slightly stronger than before. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. Jakob didn't remember falling asleep, but he woke with a start when something cold touched his hand. Disoriented, he looked down to find the dog had moved not much, just enough to rest her nose against his fingers. Her eyes were open, watching him with what might have been the first spark of real awareness he'd seen. "Hey there," he said softly, not moving his hand. "Welcome back." The tail gave the faintest wag. That first night set the pattern for the days that followed. Jakob had never been much for nursing, had always been more comfortable with trees and axes and solitude than with caring for living things. But something about this dog, her patience, her gratitude, the quiet dignity with which she accepted his help, brought out a tenderness he'd thought long buried. He named her Cedar, after the trees that surrounded his cabin, the trees that had been his companions for so long. It seemed fitting somehow. Progress was slow. For the first week, she barely moved from her spot by the fire, and Jakob carried her outside 3 times a day to relieve herself, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to buckle. He fed her broth, then soft foods, then finally small amounts of the stew and porridge that sustained him through the winter. He brushed her fur carefully, working out the mats and tangles, revealing patches of gray and black that had once probably been quite handsome. But more than the physical care, he talked to her. Years of silence had built up in him like snow on a roof, and suddenly he found himself telling her everything about the trees he was cutting, about the weather, about the chickadees that came to the feeder outside his window. He told her about the life he'd left behind, the family that had fractured and scattered, the wife who'd wanted a different kind of man than he could be. He told her about choosing these mountains, about the peace he'd found in solitude and the price that peace demanded. Cedar listened to it all with those knowing brown eyes, and Jakob found himself wondering how much she understood, how much of human folly and cruelty she'd witnessed in her years. By the second week, she could stand on her own, though she stayed close to the fire, still conserving energy. By the third week, she followed him slowly from room to room, her nails clicking on the wooden floors. And by the fourth week, when Jakob opened the door to begin his day's work, Cedar stood beside him looking out at the snow with something like eagerness. "You want to come?" Jakob asked, and her tail wagged harder, so he fashioned her a coat from an old canvas tarp, insulated with wool, and she accompanied him into the forest. She couldn't go far. She was still regaining her strength, but she lay in the snow near where he worked, watching him fell trees and limb branches. When he paused for water and bread, he shared his lunch with her, and she accepted the offering with grave politeness. It was on one of these days, nearly 6 weeks after he'd found her, that Jakob realized he was no longer alone, not just in the sense of having another living creature around, but in some deeper way. Cedar had become his companion in a way he hadn't experienced in years. She gave him purpose beyond mere survival. She gave him someone to care for, to talk to share his days with. The cabin felt warmer, the silence less oppressive, the long winter evenings less empty. He found himself laughing at her antics as she regained her strength and began exploring the area around the cabin. She had a particular fascination with the chickadees, watching them with intense focus, but never chasing. She learned the rhythms of his days quickly, knowing when it was time to work, time to eat, time to settle by the fire. And at night, she slept beside his bed, her steady breathing a comfort against the wind that howled through the peaks. Spring came slowly to the mountains, as it always did. The snow retreated reluctantly, revealing brown grass and muddy earth. The streams swelled with melt water, rushing and foaming over rocks. The days grew longer, warmer, and the silence of winter gave way to the sounds of returning birds and waking earth. Cedar blossomed with the spring. Her coat, now properly cared for, gleamed black and gray in the sunlight. The ribs no longer showed, replaced by healthy muscle and proper weight. She could run now, bounding through the meadows near the cabin with a joy that made Jakob's heart swell. She'd never be a young dog again, her muzzle stayed gray, and she moved with the careful deliberation of age. But she was alive, vibrant, and clearly happy. One morning in early May, Jakob was splitting wood when he heard voices, actual human voices, approaching up the trail. It was rare but not unheard of. Sometimes hikers made it this far, and occasionally the Forest Service checked on him. But these voices made Cedar's ears pin back, made her press close against Jakob's leg with a low growl he'd never heard from her before. 2 men emerged from the trees, both middle-aged, both dressed in expensive hiking gear that looked barely worn. The taller one stopped short when he saw Cedar, and something like recognition flickered across his face. "Is that—" he started, but his companion grabbed his arm. "Don't," the second man said sharply, but it was too late. The pieces fell into place for Jakob with sudden, sickening clarity. These men, or men like them, had owned Cedar, had driven her up here during the depths of winter, had removed her collar, and had left her to die. "You're trespassing," Jakob said, his voice flat and cold. "This is private land. Look, we don't want any trouble," the taller man said, raising his hands. "We're just passing through. We didn't realize that she survived." Jakob finished for him. Cedar pressed tighter against his leg, trembling now. "That someone would find her. That winter wouldn't do your dirty work for you." The two men exchanged glances. The shorter one spoke, his voice defensive. "We couldn't afford a vet. She was old, sick, we thought." "She wasn't sick," Jakob interrupted, his rage building cold and controlled. "She was starving because you weren't feeding her properly. And even if she had been sick, even if the vet would have cost money, there are shelters. There are humane options. You don't drive a living creature up a mountain in winter and leave her to freeze and starve alone." "It was supposed to be quick," the taller man said weakly. The cold is never quick," Jakob said. "She lay there for God knows how long, scared and alone and abandoned by the people she'd trusted her whole life. There's not much I consider unforgivable in this world, but that comes close." The shorter man's face flushed with anger. "Who are you to judge? You don't know what it's like, having an animal you can't care for. Then you find someone who can," Jakob said, and his voice was like stone. "You don't take the coward's way out. Now get off my land. And if I ever see either of you near here again, if I ever hear you've done something like this to another animal, there won't be conversation. There'll just be consequences." He didn't have a gun, didn't even have his axe in hand, but something in his voice, in his stance, made both men take a step back. They retreated down the trail quickly, their expensive hiking boots slipping in the mud, and Jakob watched until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did he kneel down beside Cedar, running his hands over her soft fur, feeling her gradually stop trembling. She licked his face once, then leaned against him with a sigh. "They're gone," he told her softly. "They'll never hurt you again, I promise you that." And he meant it. Whatever else happened, wherever life took him from here, Cedar would be safe. She would be fed and warm and cared for. She would know, for whatever years she had left, that she was not alone. They walked back to the cabin together as the afternoon sun filtered through the budding trees. Jakob found himself thinking about the winter, about how close Cedar had come to death, about how a single moment of compassion, or perhaps just stubbornness, refusing to leave suffering unhelped, had changed both their lives. He'd come to these mountains seeking solitude, convinced that isolation was what he needed. But Cedar had taught him something different. She'd taught him that there were different kinds of loneliness, and that sometimes what looked like rest, you worked both ways. He'd saved her from the winter, yes, but in doing so, she'd saved him from something else, from the slow forgetting of how to care, how to connect, how to let another being matter. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Cedar's head resting on his knee, Jakob felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just contentment, though there was that. Not just companionship, though there was that too. But something deeper. A sense that the choices he'd made, the life he'd built, had led him to exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed doing. "Good girl," he said softly, scratching behind her ears the way she liked. "Good girl, Cedar." Her tail thumped against the porch, and in her eyes he saw trust, affection, and forgiveness, not for him, but despite him, despite what humans had done to her. She'd survived winter's cruelty and found spring again, and wasn't that, in the end, a kind of miracle? The mountains darkened as night fell, but the cabin behind them glowed warm and golden. Inside, there would be dinner and a fire. Outside tomorrow, there would be work and walks, and all the small routines that made up a life. And through it all, there would be the quiet understanding between man and dog, the unspoken promise that neither would abandon the other. Jakob had spent years among these trees, learning their lessons of patience and endurance and strength. But it took a starving dog left to die in winter to teach him the most important lesson of all, that survival wasn't enough. That living meant choosing to care even when caring was difficult, choosing connection even when isolation seemed easier, choosing to show up for another being day after day after day. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant and cold and distant. But here on this porch, with this dog, Jakob felt only warmth. The winter had tested them both and found them strong enough, and whatever winters came next, they would face them together.